Hello and welcome everyone to the June live stream Q&A for all of my monthly subscribers. Thank you so much for joining me. I am in sweltering hot Athens and hoping that I can survive the heat. There is no air conditioning in this room. Oh no. How is everyone? I hope you're all doing okay. Give me a quick shout out on the chat. Let me know that you can hear me okay, that you can see me okay. I hope you like the new camera and lights. Let me know how things are going. Shout out. Woohoo. Very good. It looks like, oh, that was feedback from my own video. It looks like this is working. Give me 1 second. A few minor technical issues at the last moment, but I think we're almost ready to get started. Fantastic. Everybody's happy with my new lights and my new camera and my new microphones. Hopefully the sound is fantastic. But did you notice the flower arrangement? Yeah. This is the Patreon effect, people. We can afford orchids now. We can afford orchids. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's get started with your questions in just 1 second. First question comes from David. What are your thoughts about BIP47 reusable payment codes, and why haven't more wallets implemented this privacy feature? Really great question, David. BIP47 reusable payment codes are a mechanism developed in, I believe, 2015 that allows you to have a payment channel, effectively, that allows you to receive payments, and these payments are sent to keys that are generated using a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which means that the sender and the recipient can negotiate a key, but the sender cannot see any other payments that the recipient has received. So every time a payment is sent to a reusable payment code, it's not correlated to any other payments received. Unlike a Bitcoin address, where if you send money to a Bitcoin address and that address has been reused, then you can see all of the other payments that have been sent to it. With a reusable payment code, what you give is a watch address that allows your wallet to watch for incoming payments and then generate a specific key for each incoming payment that the sender sends money to, but as a result, they can't see any of the other payments from other senders. I think it's a fantastic privacy feature. It is a bit like Monero's watch-only or view-only public addresses. And in that way, it's a great privacy feature for wallets. Unfortunately, the only wallet that I know that has implemented something like that is Samurai with its Paynims payment channels. And that's a mechanism that uses, I believe, the BIP47 reusable payment codes. I don't know of any other wallet that has implemented it. It appears privacy is not a huge consideration for most wallets. And in fact, being a wallet developer is a really, really difficult job because you have to keep up with constant changes in the protocols and new capabilities that are available so you can make the most out of the user experience, whether that's fee estimation or new forms of addresses or new capabilities with scripts and payment mechanisms like BIP47. So I'd like to see that implemented in a lot more wallets. Great question to get us started. The next question comes from Franciscos. Is it possible for someone to guess a private key? And there's a follow-up question from Steve. Is it possible for a quantum computer to guess a private key when quantum computers go mainstream? Let's start with the first question. Is it possible to guess a private key? Possible? Yes, in a theoretical sense. In a practical sense, no. The number of keys that exist in Bitcoin is 10 to the power of 77. That's 10 with 77 zeros after it. 2 to the 256, a 256-bit number. To give you an idea of how huge that is, it's just a tiny bit less than the number of atoms in the visible universe. So pick any number in the visible universe. Did you guess the same one that I had picked? Probably not. So practically, yes, you might guess the same one that I picked. But practically speaking, it's impossible. Theoretically, you could. Practically, you could not. So it would be like winning every lottery ticket in every lottery in the world while being struck by lightning 1,000 times in a row, or some ridiculous coincidence like that. And even that is easy by comparison to guessing a private key. Several orders of magnitude easy. You'd have to do that 1 billion times in a row. Is it possible that a quantum computer could guess a private key when they go mainstream, is the follow-up question. And this is a yes and no, depending on how you look at it. Can a quantum computer guess a private key simply by trying all possible private keys? No. Can it reverse a known public key by essentially solving the discrete logarithm problem and reversing the elliptic curve multiplication? Yes, that is possible with a quantum computer. Brute forcing all possible key combinations to derive an address, no. So if you haven't already published a public key, which only happens when you spend, if you only use an address once, then even a quantum computer can't guess your private key and find it based on an address that is known to have some money in it if you've never spent from that address. And if the moment you spend from that address, that's the last time you ever use that address, you use a new one for your next transaction and it's immediately empty, well, then you have no problem. So no, not even a quantum computer when mainstream can simply guess a private key. The next question comes from Loic. Andreas, what were the questions and answers that you exchanged with Vitalik Buterin back in the days of the launch of Ethereum that convinced you that a new chain was better than building on Bitcoin? What would Bitcoin not be able to do in comparison to Ethereum? So back in the days when Vitalik was about to publish the white paper that became Ethereum, I got a copy before it was published, and I read it, and I contacted Vitalik and asked a few questions. I was curious about why this was being done in a separate chain. That's pretty much exactly the first question I asked, is why are you doing this in a separate chain instead of doing it on top of Bitcoin? And of course, if you know the history, Vitalik had tried to do it on top of Bitcoin and discovered a number of impediments to doing so. The first one was simply that the pace of development and the changes required to Bitcoin in order to implement something like that were far too great. And in a conservative system like Bitcoin, those kind of changes were simply not possible to make. The second issue, which Vitalik explained to me at the time, was that the consensus algorithm wouldn't cover things happening within a second layer protocol that might be used to do something like smart contracts as flexible as Ethereum. So at the time, Vitalik had tried to implement this as part of Omni, Omni being a layered protocol on top of Bitcoin that uses op return codes or data constructs within the Bitcoin blockchain. Here's the problem, though. When people validate the Bitcoin blockchain, when they validate a transaction or they validate a block, they validate it according to the consensus rules of Bitcoin. And if they see something that simply contains data, they don't validate the content of that data to include in the consensus rules the validation rules of whatever smart contract you might have encoded. So while you can build a second layer that uses smart contracts on top of Bitcoin, someone needs to validate those smart contracts, and it won't be the Bitcoin consensus layer that's validating them. And therefore, you need to bootstrap a complete security mechanism to validate the smart contracts. So the fundamental idea why a second chain was needed, why a new chain was needed, was so that the validation of the smart contracts was part of the consensus validation rules, and therefore everyone running a node and everyone mining or doing proof of stake or whatever consensus algorithm was implemented on this new chain would also be validating the outcomes of the smart contracts, the execution of the smart contracts themselves. Yes, you can encode smart contracts, simple ones, and those will be validated in Bitcoin. If you want to do more complex ones, you can encode the data that represents those smart contracts, but that data won't get validated by any of the participants in the consensus layer of Bitcoin. And changing Bitcoin enough to validate more complex smart contracts, more flexible smart contracts, was not going to happen. So that was the decision that led to building Ethereum on a separate chain, or at least that was the explanation that Vitalik gave me. And I found that persuasive and very interesting as an idea. So to Loic's follow-up question, wouldn't various layers over Bitcoin allow us to do all that we need? Not without making trade-offs that are unacceptable. So, and that's the fundamental problem. In order to make Bitcoin flexible enough to execute and validate smart contracts, you need to overcome a great deal of conservatism, which also is the basis for the security of the most robust proof of work chain that exists. Now, or you don't validate it, and then you have the problem that the smart contracts themselves are not as secure as the base layer. All right, let me take a quick break and drink some water. Our next question comes from Enrico. The recent Binance hack showed that no centralized system is safe from hacking. Also, the reorganization discussion, although unlikely or impossible to perform, raised the fair question on what to do in such cases. Wouldn't it be a strong disincentive to hacking if exchanges monitored the mempool and, in the case of an unauthorized transaction from the cold storage, immediately broadcast a pre-signed transaction that sends 100% of the balance as mining fee, effectively destroying the hacker's profitability? Thanks. Enrico, yes, this is a really interesting question. There's a lot of game theoretical outcomes you can have. It's really impossible to perform a rollback, and that's actually very good. It means that the system that Bitcoin uses for immutability, proof of work system of consensus, makes it very difficult, impossible to roll back the chain, even when you have a very, very well-connected and well-funded organization trying to get a reorganization. I don't think the recent Binance hack showed us that no centralized system is safe from hacking, because after you've seen that 100 times in a row, the 101st time doesn't really add much more new knowledge or new information to that equation. It's like, oh, every exchange centralized that's hacked before has told us that lesson. One more, do we really need to learn that lesson again and again and again before we realize that centralized systems are extremely vulnerable? So what to do in such cases? Well, one thing you could do in such cases is let the exchange and the customers eat the loss, which is exactly what's been happening all of this time. And that's not necessarily a bad outcome. What it does is it incentivizes users to control their own funds and not store them on exchanges or give control, custody of their funds to others. And it incentivizes exchanges that may lose 2 or 3 years of their operating profits, because their profit margins are pretty thin, in a single hack. And if this happens every 2 to 3 years, they never make a profit. Eventually they go out of business. So what about a pre-signed transaction that sends 100% of the balance to the miners? Well, first of all, such a transaction would probably succeed in being mined instead of the unauthorized transaction. That would require exchanges to hold such pre-signed transactions. But think about this. If you build a button that is the nuclear option that blows up some part of your cold storage, some UTXOs of your cold storage, and you keep that. It can be in cold storage itself. Like the pre-signed transaction needs to be ready to go because you need to be able to react very, very quickly. So you're going to put it on a warm system. That means that that's floating around somewhere. Now imagine what an attacker can do with that. They don't have to steal anything from you. All they have to do is be one of the miners and then blow up your exchange cold storage and redirect all of the funds themselves. So what this would actually do is it would incentivize miners to hack exchanges, find their nuclear button, and push it, and burn all of the cold storage into the mining pool, and then earn it back as fees as a miner. So it would give a really good incentive to miners to blow up exchanges, which probably isn't a good idea. Also, if you have an attacker that's not motivated by money, but is motivated by causing mayhem, it would be a lot easier to get to these pre-signed transactions than to get to the cold storage keys themselves, which means now it's easier to hack an exchange if all you want to do is destroy it than it is to hack it if you want to steal money. So again, it creates these very weird incentives for denial of service attacks and those kinds of attacks. I think ironically what would happen is any exchange that created this kind of thing would likely get attacked by its own competitors, other exchanges that have now found a fantastic way to turn off the competition. The next question comes from Brisby. I believe in not your keys, not your coin. But is the keyless, seedless, threshold signature cryptography stuff any better or safer for hot wallets? Good question. So let's talk about keyless, seedless, threshold signature cryptography. This is based on a recent paper that was published by a doctoral student at Princeton University that suggests a mechanism for doing threshold signatures in ECDSA, which is directly applicable to Bitcoin. ECDSA is the digital signature algorithm on elliptic curve that is used in Bitcoin, and threshold signatures allow you to construct a signature as a sum of parts of signatures that can be distributed to different devices. So it's effectively multisig without the multisig. You can create threshold signatures where you require a certain threshold be met, whereby if you have 3 of the 5 parts or 2 of the 3 parts of a key, you can sign a transaction with that threshold signature. Now, what is the advantage of a threshold signature versus a multi-signature? In a multi-signature, when you sign the multi-signature transaction, you broadcast to the world exactly what the multi-signature scheme is. So within the signature, you also provide the script sig, which is the script that you're signing. And what that contains is the exact prescription or recipe, if you like, of the multisig. So it will say, here's a script that expects 2 out of 3 of the following 3 public keys. And here's a signature that belongs to one of them. And here's another signature that belongs to another one of them. Therefore, we've satisfied this script. Therefore, every time you sign with a multisig, you reveal what the scheme is. So you show what the K of N or M of N scheme is. So you know it's 2 of 3. You also show all of the public keys that are involved, even the one that didn't sign. And that's a lot of privacy leaking information, because obviously someone who's watching the blockchain can now construct a pattern and see that this was how it was signed, and they know a lot about it. They may know what wallet created it based on the type of scheme it's using. They may also, over time, if you're reusing multisig, of course, they're going to be able to see that it's the same person and do statistical analysis. So yeah, that's one of the disadvantages of multisig. With threshold signatures, it looks like a straight public key signature. What you don't know is that in order to construct the public key and the signature, you had to add together several public keys and several signatures to achieve a certain threshold that is not visible to anyone. But all you know is that the signature satisfies the public key. So it looks like a straightforward pay to public key which is a standard payment. You can't even tell that's a script. Now, this was implemented, threshold signature cryptography was implemented recently over ECDSA, and some projects have implemented wallets that allow you to do a special type of multisig, which is multi-factor multisig. Now, you can think of multisig as being useful in two ways. One is 3 people get together and they have 1 key each, and they create, say, a 2 of 3 multisig. So you have a multisig that is a multi-user multisig for 3 people. But another way to use multisig, which is very interesting, is multi-factor multisig. That's where, let's say I have 2 devices and a backup key, and I construct a 2 of 3 multisig where I own all 3 keys, but I own them on different devices. So let's say I have 1 key on my laptop, I have 1 key on my phone, and then I have a 3rd key that I simply back up and put in a vault. And I can do this also with mnemonic seeds instead of keys, so that I can have multiple keys coming out of them. Now, if I do that, then if I want to do a transaction, I have to sign on my laptop, and then I have to sign again the same transaction on my mobile or smartphone, so that I get 2 out of the 3. And if I lose one of the 2 devices, I go to my backups and I pull out the 3rd key and I use it to move all of the funds and construct a new 2 of 3 multisig in which I actually still have all the keys. Multi-factor multisig is a very useful security mechanism, but if you do it with traditional multisig, you reveal the fact that you're using multisig every time you use it. So this was a recommendation and a project to do that with threshold signatures, which do not reveal that. Unfortunately, the security of ECDSA threshold signatures is not exactly proven yet. In fact, I think there is a much better way of doing threshold signatures, and that's using Schnorr signatures. With Schnorr signatures, there is formal proof that threshold signatures are actually equivalent in security to regular signatures. So you can actually prove the security model with a formal proof. So we will be able to do threshold signatures with Schnorr, and together with Taproot and TapScript, which are 2 new proposals, you can do this kind of multi-sig that looks like a single signature payment to a normal payment, but is actually multi-sig behind the scenes. You can do that with the combination of technologies. It's great for security, it's great for privacy, it gives you that perfect balance. I think we are going to see more use of threshold signatures, especially for the use case of multi-factor multi-sig, where a single user is using multiple devices to increase their level of security. And I hope we see it with Schnorr signatures, which are not only more compact, but where that threshold signature scheme is being proven to be secure. All right, a similar question comes from Dave. Key storage best practices for organizations. Hi, Andreas. What are the best options for organizations to securely store their digital assets long-term where multi-sig is required to spend? Thanks, Dave. So this is a very difficult question to answer, primarily because the needs of different organizations vary so much that it's difficult to know exactly what the best option is. But I think a general good recipe is to use industry best standards and best practices that already exist, that are well understood, and not try to do some kind of weird implementation where you only know how it works. So what would I mean by industry best standards? I would, for example, consider building a combination of a solution based on a combination of technologies such as BIP39 mnemonics that produce BIP32 hierarchical deterministic wallets that are used under a BIP43 scheme to produce hierarchical multisig wallets under, for example, BIP48. And these are then backed up on paper. And the seeds themselves are produced and stored on hardware wallets, preferably not a single vendor's hardware wallets, but a number of different vendors' hardware wallets to have a bit of variety. And then with sufficient backups and sufficient number of keys that the organization can survive, the kind of accident that might take out, for example, 2 directors at the same time. If you have a big organization and there's lots of directors, you want to carefully construct a scheme so that there's enough redundancy, but you don't have so many keys that it's trivial to break them. Then you have to consider how you do the signatures themselves. Generally speaking, it's best to use signing in different locations where the different directors can use, for example, a hardware wallet onto a computer that is not connected to the internet, where they transfer what's called a partially signed Bitcoin transaction, or PSBT. Sign it and then pass it along to the next person in the chain until it's properly signed and transmitted to the network. This is a common scheme that's used by a lot of exchanges. So a lot of exchanges will have their cold storage in some kind of multisig, maybe a 2 of 3, maybe a 3 of 5, maybe a 4 of 7, or a 5 of 8, or some scheme like that. And some keys will be in vaults, some keys will be given to directors, they'll be on hardware wallets, also backed up in vaults, and they'll pass a transaction for signing, authenticating that the transaction actually is a legitimate one with multiple people getting involved, so you don't have a single point of failure, and you have sufficient backups. This is the kind of thing that requires a very careful consideration of what are the specific threats you're protecting against. What are the threat vectors? What kind of attackers are you protecting against? Is this for protecting against state-level actors? Are you looking at a multi-jurisdictional solution where you want to protect against confiscation of funds by a state-level actor? Are you simply looking to protect against the kind of opportunistic criminal theft? Are you looking to do recovery for business continuity and planning purposes? Are you the kind of environment where the directors might work in the same office, which might be dangerous, if something happens to that specific location? All of these considerations need to come into how you build an organizational key management policy. But also, there are quite a few complexities that come up when you try to do this. One of them, for example, is that today's multi-signature schemes are static, which means that once you've built it, if you then fire one of the directors, or you have to recycle or change one of the keys because something happened to one of the keys, what you have to do is sweep all of that cold storage to a completely new set of keys that you construct new addresses from. So there's a lot of challenges to any such scheme. Another approach to use, which is also commonly used, is to use some kind of Shamir secret sharing scheme where you take a single key and you break it into lots of parts. The problem with that is that every time you sign, you have to bring the parts together. And at the moment when you bring the parts together, that key exists in its entirety in one place, and that's extremely vulnerable to attacks. Not the best solution. So those are some of the key storage best practices for organizations. I know I rattled off a bunch of BIPs, BIP39, BIP32, BIP43, BIP48, and you should look those up and see what they're about. But it's kind of the standards we use across hierarchical deterministic multi-sig wallets based on hardware wallets and mnemonic seeds. Let me take a quick break. I apologize for my slurping noises. It takes too many clicks to turn off the microphone. It is so hot, I'm getting dehydrated as we speak. Privacy timelines. Craig asks, it sounds like, fortunately, Bitcoin will become anonymous once different upgrades are made. Could you give us the timelines of when Schnorr Signature's confidential transactions Taproot and Graftroot will go online in Bitcoin. Will this give total anonymity, or will further upgrades be necessary? And if you know, when will they come about? Craig, I wish I could share your optimism. It takes a lot of different approaches to achieve privacy, and privacy is an ever-moving target because you've got to think about this in terms of an adversarial arms race, meaning that while people are building privacy-defeating technologies, developers in Bitcoin are building privacy technologies, and of course in many other open blockchains, especially those that are privacy-focused. So if we have better privacy technology in Bitcoin, then that then gives all of the incentives for the surveillance companies and the analytics companies to continue to violate the privacy of millions of people by escalating their capabilities. And of course, when they invent something new, that then becomes the new state of the art, which very quickly leaks or gets shared. So that, of course, you can't have just the good guys using surveillance technology. In fact, the bad guys are the ones using surveillance technology, but that goes from the bad guys to the worst guys to the even worse guys to the dictators and murderers and brutal regimes. So one of the problems with this is that the arms race causes this escalation of technology that falls into worse and worse hands. So, yes, we're looking at a number of technologies to improve the privacy of Bitcoin. Schnorr signatures is a bit helpful, especially with threshold signing, as I mentioned in the previous answer. Taproot and Graftroot. Taproot is likely to be implemented sooner. Graftroot maybe a bit later. Confidential transaction is not currently scheduled for an implementation. It hasn't been finalized as a BIP. It currently is being tested on the Elements sidechain, but not on Bitcoin. So will this give total anonymity? No, absolutely not. And you would need to combine these techniques with various forms of coin join and other privacy techniques, like, for example, how wallets use change addresses, how they order outputs, what fingerprints they leave as to the transactions they're constructing, preferably avoiding leaving any fingerprints, how they do things like deterministic signing and things like that. All of these activities increase privacy. The more you do, the fewer fingerprints you leave in the transaction, the harder it is to identify what kind of wallet was used, which means you can do less statistical analysis. And of course, if you can use various forms of confidential transactions, encryption, coin join, etc., it makes it even better. I expect that there will be a fair degree of pushback against strong privacy in Bitcoin. I think it's a big battle that we need to fight. And I think that we need to win that battle, because if we don't have stronger privacy in Bitcoin, that gives many different attackers a way to attack Bitcoin users by violating their privacy and punishing them for using Bitcoin by revealing their identities, which weakens, of course, Bitcoin. So I hope we'll see more and more upgrades in the future, but this is not going to be easy. And more importantly, it's not going to end. We're going to need to keep increasing the privacy efforts as we learn more and as the attacks against privacy become more sophisticated. This is a continuous arms race. All right, this is a great question. Enrico asks, in the white paper, Satoshi describes the Bitcoin network like a distributed timestamp server. I was surprised to find in the blockchain 2 contiguous blocks where the child's timestamp was 2 seconds before the parent's timestamp. What is the reason behind this apparent inconsistency? What a great question. It's important to understand that in terms of calling it a timestamp server, I think it's probably best to refer to Bitcoin not as a timestamping service, but more as a sequencing service. So what is absolutely solid is the sequence of transactions within and blocks within the Bitcoin blockchain, not the timestamps inside the blocks. Because you've got to realize that because the blocks are produced by different block producers, miners around the world, and they're operating computers that are attempting to keep synchronized clocks, but these synchronized clocks are not perfectly accurate. So what actually sequences the blocks is the fact that in every block, there is a hash to the previous block, the parent. And here you're saying the child timestamp, which contains the hash of its parent, had a timestamp 2 seconds before the parent's timestamp in the same block. So what's happened there? Now, clearly we know that the miner that produced the child had seen the parent first. How do we know that? Because the hash is in there. So the fact that the child has the parent's hash in its block header tells us that when the child was mined, the parent block had been seen. And here, what's happening is a little quirk that occurs because of the amount of space that's available inside the block for actually mining. So when miners are mining, what they're doing is they're repeatedly hashing the block header and changing one bit of information at a time in order to change the output hash. So that bit of information is called the nonce. Now, there is a nonce field within the header, but it's only 32 bits long, which actually runs out very, very fast. When that runs out, then in order to continue to try for different hashes, the miners need to cycle through other elements of the block. There's a couple of different ways they can do that. One is to change the Merkle root of transactions, and that can be done simply by reordering 2 transactions in the block, or changing the order of 2 branches in the Merkle tree. That will change the Merkle root, which is 256 bits long, and then you can try the 32-bit nonce again. That takes quite a bit more computation. You have to do quite a few hashes just to change around the Merkle root. However, changing the timestamp, which is also part of the block header, is an easier way to get extra bits to fiddle with when you're trying to produce different hashes. So if you change 1 bit in the timestamp, then you can go through another 32 bits of nonce. Then you can change another bit in the timestamp and go through another 32 bits of nonce. So what miners do is they skew the time in the timestamp of the block. So even though the computer's clocks are actually fairly well synchronized, they're not off by 2 seconds, especially when they've already seen the parent. What they're doing is the child timestamp in this case was used to basically, as a fudge factor, to basically cause the hash to change so that a new 32-bit nonce sequence could be used. And because the timestamp is not critical to reaching consensus, there are limits to how much forward or backward you can have the timestamp. But 2 seconds before the parent is not a problem for the consensus validation rules, and the timestamp is not that critical information in the block. What is critical is the sequence of blocks based on the hashes, the links to parents. The miner here fudged the timestamp or skewed the timestamp so much that it ended up going into the past. It doesn't matter. It's a good way to use the limited space of nonce that's available in the block. A rather esoteric issue. Pretty good job noticing that, but not critical for consensus. Kevin asks, hi, Andreas. What do you see as the biggest obstacles for DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, right now? I'm particularly interested in solutions to the civil attack problem. To me, it seems like a practical solution to that problem will open the door to a lot of really interesting concepts like on-chain elections and universal basic income. Do you agree with the importance of this issue, and what other issues should new DAOs be focusing on? Great question. So the Sybil attack problem, which you can actually read up on by reading Sybil on Wikipedia, and it's spelled S-Y-B-I-L. The Sybil attack problem is a problem understood in distributed systems that predates Bitcoin. And it is the fact that you can create an unlimited number of fake virtual computers online. So any kind of mechanism of truth or voting or any kind of mechanism where you're using some form of identity to count something or distribute something can be easily gamed, where one person can create 1,000, 100,000, 1,000,000 fake nodes or fake IDs or fake avatars or fake Twitter accounts or fake whatever, and then basically break the distributed system. So let's say, for example, you're doing on-chain elections. Well, if I can create thousands of voting identities and you can't have any way of verifying those voting identities, then I can vote 1,000 times. Universal basic income, if I create lots of fake people, I can get paid universal basic income lots of times. Within decentralized systems like consensus, the reason we have proof of work is because proof of work is a direct solution to Sybil problems, which is, how do you know the miners are real? How do you know someone's actually put any effort into mining? And the way you know is because there is proof of the work they did in every block. So that means you get the one CPU, one vote, or in this case, one ASIC, one vote. And that solves the Sybil attack problem because you can't spin up a miner without proof of work, and therefore you can't create fake mining. Your mining has to be real because it has to contain this proof of work. So Sybil attacks are a big problem. They're a big problem in a number of distributed systems, and so far one of the best, there's basically two ways to solve that. One is centralized. So I mentioned previously elections or universal basic income. How do we solve Sybil attacks in things like social security systems or welfare systems or elections? We solve those problems very poorly through centralized identity verification mechanisms, like providing a national ID or dipping your finger in indelible ink, or some kind of biometric or something like that. All of these are flawed systems because, you know, with biometrics, the biometrics have to be checked against the database, and that database can have multiple fabricated entries in it. You could have, with identity, you know, if you compromise the identity mechanism, then you can create fake people. You can have dead people who are apparently alive and voting freely, as the joke goes in some parts of the world, where every year the number of people who vote far exceeds the number of people who are actually alive in the country. You can do all kinds of things. So even these centralized solutions, which are very costly to maintain, are subject to Sybil attacks. And of course, with decentralized solutions, it's even worse. If you can't see the other person, if you can't have any form of verification, and you don't want to use a centralized solution, then this problem becomes very, very difficult. I can spin up thousands of nodes on cloud servers to pretend to be doing things. You know, if you want to do a vote or a poll or a survey on Twitter, or you want to troll people, it's very easy to spin up thousands of accounts and then vote thousands of times and skew the outcome of any survey, poll, voting mechanism or something like that. So that's one problem with the DAOs. Now, so how do you solve the Sybil attack? Interestingly enough, one way you solve it is proof of work. So theoretically, at least, you could have DAOs where, in order to participate in the DAO, you would have to submit proof of work. I imagine basically an autonomous organization that's based on a decentralized system, some kind of network that is used to do some kind of function, let's say payments. And in order to participate in this decentralized autonomous organization, you have to demonstrate proof of work through mining. Wait, I just described Bitcoin. Well, Bitcoin is a DAO. So once you realize that Bitcoin is the DAO that solves the Sybil attack through proof of work, this all suddenly makes sense. We don't have other solutions for Sybil attacks. One other proposed solution is to use proof of stake. So if you put real money up, then it's difficult to fake having multiple participants, but at the same time, then it means $1, one vote. And $1, one vote is a system we used to have. It's called aristocracy. And it's not a very good system. In fact, it would go even worse. It would become a full-on plutocracy. And so, again, this is a difficult problem to solve. I think an equally difficult problem to solve with DAOs is the oracle problem, which you might find interesting. And the oracle problem is the fact that a lot of the most useful things you want to do require you to get information from outside the chain. And then how do you verify that that information is correct? And how do you make sure that incorrect information can't be injected into the DAO? That's a very difficult problem to solve. And of course, the kinds of platforms that are experimenting with this are extremely interesting. It's one of the reasons why I'm interested in Ethereum, is because it provides a platform for experimenting on exactly these questions and trying to find solutions on these questions that is happening at scale with real money at stake and adversarial conditions. And that's not really happening on any other chain. All right, quick break again. I'll make some slurping sounds. Might want to mute your speakers. Peppermint tea, so nice. Let me check in the chat room. I'm now going to see a ton of messages saying, your sound cut off. I haven't heard anything for the last half hour. Oh, apparently not. My sound has continued. Woohoo! All right, let's see what else we have here. I love that this question is like the 10th or 15th question. I thought this would be the first question and completely derail my live stream Q&A, but I have 10 minutes, so let's do it. What are your thoughts on Libra and Calibra and Zook Libra? Now that they have been, and that wasn't actually in the question. Let me start again. What are your thoughts on Libra now that they have been announced? I mean, reading through all of the recently released information about Facebook's Libra blockchain and Calibra wallet, Jake asks. The previous question you answered about the coin was before this announcement. It looks like you were spot on with your assessment. Thank you, Jake. I don't think I was, but thank you. But is there anything you'd like to add now that we have had more information, such as the consensus algorithm being used? Thanks a lot. So first of all, I think we need to start with a very, very important point, which is Libra was announced through a white paper. There is no blockchain. There is no network. There is no payment system. There is no production deployment. There is a testnet, and there's some sample code. The most interesting thing that everyone's speculating about is the idea that this thing, Libra, will be deployed to Facebook's 2 billion users. If I had launched that white paper, nobody would be really excited about it, nor would they be writing articles, certainly not based on simply reading the white paper. People would read the white paper and go, oh, an Ethereum clone with a bit of Tendermint BFT thrown in for good measure, some Byzantine fault tolerance, a token mechanism, some basic smart contracts, a new smart contract programming language, kind of like we already have 2 or 3 of those. And people would be discussing, is this more like Cardano? Is this more like EOS? Is it more like Ethereum? Is it more like Lisk or whatever the other systems are out there that I haven't really paid attention to? But the bottom line is, the only reason anyone's talking about this is because Facebook launched it, and the immediate next thought is, and they have 2 billion users. Well, let me make a radical prediction here, and that is that very little from this white paper will actually survive to deployment on those 2 billion users. And the reason for that is because what is described in the white paper is a fairly progressive, fairly decentralized, more decentralized than some of the supposedly open decentralized cryptocurrencies that we see out there. Fairly robust, well thought out, well-researched proposal for an interesting blockchain. Not as interesting as Bitcoin, in my opinion, not as interesting as Ethereum, certainly not as decentralized in either case. We're talking about a federated set of pre-screened validators who have to put down $10 million to participate, which they've already done. A system of rewards based on a token that's issued to the validators, et cetera, et cetera. None of which is particularly revolutionary, but it's certainly quite decentralized. And the chance that Facebook would deploy it as is very, very doubtful. First of all, this thing doesn't have the necessary KYC, know your customer, and anti-money laundering protections that would be required of any corporation releasing what is effectively a system that is centralized. If this is released to Facebook users, Facebook will be under enormous scrutiny. And even if they release it to a small subset of users, it can't be open to everybody else. You can't just simply download a client like the Calibra wallet and start injecting transactions into the network without identifying yourself and interacting with the identified users of Facebook. I can't imagine any scenario where that would happen. Effectively, at that point, Facebook is acting as a user interface to a banking payment system for which they're not doing the necessary customer identification. I'm no fan of customer identification. I think we need open, private, borderless, neutral, censorship-resistant blockchains. Fortunately, we have a few of those, and even some that have robust privacy. And one of the interesting things about all of these blockchains is that anyone can connect from anywhere in the world, perhaps even over Tor and things like that, and inject transactions that nobody can censor that go from unknown user A to unknown user B for unknown purpose C, and it just works, right? So what Libra will be when it's deployed is not open because that would violate a dozen laws in 100 different jurisdictions. It's not borderless because that would violate another dozen laws in another 100 jurisdictions. It can't be censorship resistant because that's not allowed. It can't be neutral because that's not allowed. Your funds will have to be subject to seizure, confiscation, and censorship, especially for the wallets that are controlled by Facebook itself. But I can't see any scenario where they will allow any other wallets to interact with this network without creating a whole legal mess for themselves. And of course, it won't really be tradable in the open markets because the open markets, a lot of the open markets would require you to be able to make transactions with unknown users. And I imagine, for example, a decentralized exchange that could take Libra and convert it into Bitcoin with all of its scary pseudo-anonymity, or even worse, something much more private, converting Libra to Monero and back. What a mess. So for all of those reasons, it's also not going to be immutable. It's not going to be publicly verifiable. You have to pay $10 million to verify it. So it's not going to be that transparent and auditable either, although you may be able to download a copy of the chain and watch all of the clearly identified Facebook users sending Zuckbucks to each other. As a result, it really can't serve the unbanked, or at least not a very big chunk of the unbanked. It might serve a very narrow range of the unbanked, those who are sufficiently identified to Facebook and have access to advanced internet technologies, kind of like M-Pesa does. And basically on the same basis where they can't transmit it across borders. It won't be able to serve developing countries that have currency problems and problems with central bank authority, like India, for example. They are going to put up a big fuss because imagine a situation where the Indian central bank wants to devalue its currency and Indian users can move some of their rupees or all of their rupees into Libra. Now, Libra doesn't sound like it has a hard currency because it doesn't have a monetary policy, or rather it does have a monetary policy, and that's whatever the validators say it is. They just don't call it that. And even so, if it's based on a basket of currencies, it would be a hard currency compared to the rupee that's being devalued at the time. And I'm not picking on India. This would apply to, just as an example, because they recently did devaluation and demonetization. This would apply to dozens of other countries that are going through these kinds of problems where they need or want or think they need the central bank authority to devalue the currency in order to control the economy in a central way and manage fluctuations in interest rates and exchange rates, and especially manage increasingly large debt loads. They're going to cede this authority to Facebook so that their users can simply opt out of the devaluation by moving their money into Facebook's Libra. I don't think so. So from all of those perspectives, I don't really see it as being a cryptocurrency. I think what it is PayPal on a much bigger scale, so PayPal as Facebook, and competing with things like WeChat Pay and Alipay and things like that, but also competing against Apple Pay and the banks. It competes very directly against retail banks and their really crappy payment systems like Zello. It's going to blow those out of the water for sure. But it comes with baggage, and this baggage is really horrific. It comes with the baggage of the worst surveillance capitalism company on the planet, with the least amount of ethical behavior that is being caught again and again, violating in the most egregious ways the privacy of its users. And not just that, but also manipulating the emotional state of its users for political reasons or simply for profit reasons, which I don't know what's worse. Who knows? There's not much difference these days. Selling all of its users' data to surveillance companies. They say in the paper they won't. You know, one day, shortly after the launch, you're going to receive a little email that will say, we would like to inform you of some very important changes to our terms and conditions. Please read the following 666-page document containing illegible gibberish and legalese to find out exactly how we screwed your privacy this time, if you can understand any of it. And that promise goes away. So for all of those reasons, Libra is not going to compete with cryptocurrencies. It will compete with central banks and retail banks. It's going to push regulators really, really hard. It's not going to help the unbanked in the way that really matters. And it's not going to provide the world with an open, free system that is the true internet of money, even though they say that in the very first paragraph of the paper. Thank you very much. I think that was a great question to end on. I hope you enjoyed this Q&A. I won't be buying any Libra because in order to buy Libra, I'd have to install that shitware onto my smartphone, and there's no way in hell I would ever do that. So until then, sorry, none for me. It's been a lot of fun. By the way, I'm on the last city of my 28-day, 22 appearance, 7-city mega Europe tour. Throughout the 6 previous cities, I've done happy hours. I've done happy hours in Sofia, Bulgaria, in Berlin, Germany, in London, England, in Edinburgh, Scotland, in Zurich, Switzerland, in Munich, Germany again, and my next one is going to be in Athens, Greece. It's been an amazing experience. Not only the events, the community events that you have funded through your Patreon contributions, which have allowed me to do my work and give these talks to audiences that are paying nothing to attend, open community meetups to support the local meetup groups, but also to meet lots of you at the happy hours, which has been so much fun. Many of these happy hours went a bit long because I was having too much fun. And you know, all of that is possible because of your contributions. In the last month, we had the largest number of new Patreon users since December of 2017, which is a fantastic turnaround. We've lost a lot of Patreon users over the last year and a half. And I'd like to think that maybe some of that isn't because of the price, but some of it is because of your tremendous support on this really, really fun tour where I got to meet so many people and give out all of this free education because of the money that you've contributed. Part of that money went into this great new camera and these great new lights and these great new microphones that I'm hoping are giving you a better quality experience. We'll get some great videos out to you. So once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for supporting my work for free education. I hope I've made you proud on this 7-city tour. It's not over yet. Come see me in Athens at the meetup, July 12th, or hopefully join me for the Patreon happy hour on July 13th. That's all from me. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.